Before I start with my talk, I want to tell you a story. And it's a very personal story. It's a story about me 20 years ago. When I was about 15 years, yes, I'm 35. I was about 15 years, and I was brought up in Amsterdam, so I'm Dutch. And some of my friends were quite rebellious, and they tended to sometimes steal things from the shop. And they were talking about, ooh, this is a kick, a rush, quite, they enjoyed it almost. And me being brought up in a family with values and stealing is not okay, I was a bit like, ooh, this is intriguing, what's going on? And I did find myself in a shop one day, and I did steal something. And as I was trying to walk out, my heart pounding, obviously, waiting for that feeling of that rush and that kick, I didn't. I had no rush, I had no kick, and the adrenaline was still there, but I felt shame and guilt. Oh my God, so much guilt about what I've done. I never told anyone, not even my friends, not even my parents, and the only reason I can tell you this is because my parents are not alive anymore, so therefore they will never find out. I told this story for the first time at the ethics conference that Andrea has been referring to. Because sometimes we can find ourselves, even though we see ourselves as a good person, you can find yourself in a situation where you make a bad decision and you feel bad about it. So today's topic will be about good people, like we all think you all see yourself probably as a good person. Why do you find yourself sometimes in making a bad decision in a certain situation? As we know in technology, you guys are making a massive impact. Even if you're building a small part of a bigger thing, like a health app, fantastic impacts that you're having on people's lives. Even in healthcare, machines that surgeons are using are improving because of the work that you do. But sometimes your work can also have a negative impact on people's lives. And that's what I want you to become aware of during this talk. Could it be that certain processes that we know are out there because of experiments and research that we do that can explain why sometimes you find yourself making that bad decision or not making a decision at all? We know that in Facebook, scandals like Facebook and Volkswagen, that these things can happen in your industry. So what can you do? Where does your responsibility start and where does it stop? Do you need to keep quiet or do you need to quit? Are those the only options you have? And what can organizations do if it is really scary to do something about that? So these are the three topics I'll be talking about today in this talk. Most of the things and the knowledge that us psychologists have comes from experiments back in the 1950s. And I must say, honestly, most of those experiments would never pass any ethical board today. So we also came from a very unethical place. Luckily, that's been improved now. And this was one of the experiments that was conducted back in the 1950s. It's actually quite simple. It's nothing more than a simple visual test. As you can see, the question is to you, which line in the right box matches the line in the left box? What's your answer? See, very simple, right? This is easy. You're thinking easy. This psychology, right? But it's not that simple, is it? Because imagine following. I knew everybody was coming, and I've instructed everyone to provide the wrong answer. And I've asked them to give that the wrong answer actually really quick, So before you had a chance to give the answer, someone else would have already said the wrong answer. My question to you would be, what would you do? What would you answer? Would you still say, see, as you all hesitantly almost said now, would you still provide that answer? Some people will, but there's also a lot of people who don't. This visual test, come in, you can come in. This visual test was executed by Solomon Asch. And Solomon Asch was a psychologist, and he wanted to research how much people are willing to conform in situation. How much are people willing to ignore reality in order to stay and stick to their group and not stand out? What was his results? He did this experiment at least 12 times, and he found that 75% are willing to conform at least once. 75%. Why do we conform? Because we have a very strong need to not to be different. We want to fit in with others. We don't want to be that person that's slightly different than the rest of us. So, when I did this talk in July at Ethics, I obviously wanted to see, is this something that is influencing how engineers, how developers are reporting these issues? And there was one questionnaire, I don't know if you're familiar with this is Stack Overflow questionnaire. It's quite a famous questionnaire, I think. And for the first time, Stack Overflow added 4 questions related to ethics. And this was one question that got my attention, obviously, as you can see why, because it's about reporting, it's about saying something about an ethical issue. And almost 50% of the people who answered this questionnaire, that was about 70,000 respondents, said it really depends on what the situation is. And that was interesting because there's a few other things that Solomon Asch found when he was researching this conformity. We see that when situations become less clear-cut, like less black and white, like that visual test, that's so simple, it's so black and white, it's so easy. But even in that situation, already 75% people ignored that. They ignored the reality. So when the situation becomes less clear, we tend to conform even more. And don't forget, you work in situations that are not always clear, they're very complex, and they're also fast-moving, so you have to make decisions really quick. He found one other really important aspect in his experiments. The bigger the group and the complicated the task, we tend to even conform more. And I think that applies exactly to the industry that we're working in. So we have a responsibility to become aware of this phenomenon, this bias that we have discovered, and that is with us for 50 years. But also don't forget that conformity has a very strong social meaning. Conformity helps us to stay in a group, to become a part of a society. To not conform, we risk a lot of things, like being ridiculed for standing and speaking up. We don't want that. We don't want to be excluded from a group. We're social beings. We need other people to function. So conformity helps us to form rules, like we don't do that, we don't murder people, that's what we do. If you do, you are being excluded from this group. So it's got a really important function in our society, not to be overlooked. There's another really strong phenomena in psychology. There's loads of phenomena, lots of biases. Obviously, I can't address them all in this talk, but I wanted to highlight one more for today's talk. And that is obedience. And I find obedience really interesting because, not first of all because of the experiments that we've done, but also how strongly it's, again, integrated in our society. And obedience is the process or the phenomena where we alter our behavior because of someone we see that has more power than us. So we change our behavior under the influence of people who have more power than us. And the psychologist that researched and experimented most with this was Stanley Milgram. And Stanley was a psychologist, and he was also Jewish. He survived the Second World War, and he witnessed the Nuremberg trials. And I don't know if anybody who's familiar with that, but the Nuremberg trials is where they prosecuted the soldiers and commanders and generals who were responsible mainly for the mass deportation of the Jewish people. And Milgram was witness to one of the generals, General Eichmann, who was in charge of one of those big deportations. And Eichmann said at the trials, "I feel no shame, I feel no guilt. I was only executing an order." This triggered Milgram. He was triggered by this. And he said, could it be that this is something that only happens to German? No offense if there's German here, but that's what he thought. This is a German thing. But soon enough he realized, wait, this is not a German thing. This is, everybody does this. This is transcultural. So he started up his experiment. This is an old picture, but that's what he did. This is called the electric shock experiment. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this experiment. Yes, so there's a few people here, so that's great. But for the ones who have never heard about this, I'll take you through the experiment. So what you can see here is a person who is actually on in the experiment, and he is being attached to an electric shock machine. This student has been ordered to memorize word pairs. And those word pairs, he's going to be tested on the memory of those word pairs by a teacher. And the teacher is actually the person who is actually a participant of the experiment. So he doesn't know what's happening. So the teacher is in a different room from the student. And he is sat in front of this machine. And that machine can give electric shocks to the student. With him in the room is someone with a white lab coat who tells him if he doesn't want to give the shock, you need to give this shock. You should give this shock. Obviously, the student gives the wrong answer, and then the teacher has to give this shock. So what happens? The max shock that the teachers could give was 450 volts. You would die. You will not survive that, okay? To be clear, you will not survive a 450 volt shock. Curious? How many people would give that shock? No? Yes? 65% of all the participants in this experiment. This experiment has been replicated after Milgram did it. Some of them reported 85% of teachers, of experimenters, administering that highest shock. It's quite shocking, isn't it? So I wondered, is this something that could be going on when we are talking about ethics in technology? Could we sometimes not looking to ourselves or taking responsibility ourselves, or looking to other people? And funny enough, I found another question that I could link to this phenomena. Who is responsible for the code you write? And almost 60% of you say, it's not me. It's upper management who makes that decision. And again, I think we shouldn't underestimate how strong obedience is within our brain. You've been taught from a young age, from a child, to respect your teachers, to look up to people who are in power, like the police. This is something you have been taught from a very young age. And therefore, I completely agree when Milgram says it's hard to escape from the clause of obedience. Right, I hope you're not feeling too depressed right now, otherwise I'll have a lot of work to do after. So let's start with the section of this talk where we try to see what we can do. What we can do, not only as a person, and later on also what we can do as a community and as an industry. So when I first started talking about this, there was not much happening, right? So back in July, there was, I think there was Google that announced that we're going to work together with the Pentagon on this artificial intelligence program. And about a dozen of engineers quit. I think that was the only news that was brought up when it came about talking about ethics. And that was interesting. I'll go back to it later. What you can do about this, and I want to refer back to my story, my own personal story. Because when I felt guilty and when I felt horrendous, it was actually my inner compass telling me, this is not right, Andrea, you should not be doing this. I also never stole again after that situation. So one thing that you can do is decide when you are working, is this something that feels right for me? Yes or no? Sometimes you don't know whether that is right or not, because sometimes you've built something for the good and it can later be used for the bad. Secondly, it's very important to be courageous, because what is the thing that you ultimately need to do is to speak up. Before you can do that, you need those two other things. You need to know what you want to say, and then you need to find the courage to say it. As I said, Google was the only example we had back then. But this week, in a week's time, I don't even know what happened this week, we had Google walkout. And it wasn't just a sexual harassment that was going on. There were other issues engineers did not agree with. And I found this. This was Microsoft's open letter to Microsoft. They said, we want you to pull out of this project. We do not want to work on this project. So these are two very clear examples of literally within the space of almost 2 weeks, that shows that you do not only have to quit or keep quiet. There's things that you can do. You can speak up. And as these two examples really clearly show, you can speak up in many ways. You can speak up maybe just to your manager or to someone who has got a specific role in your company that you can address this with. So think about what you're going to say and who you're going to say it to. Potentially, maybe you want to write an open letter like the Microsoft employees did. There are things that you can do. But as conformity and obedience tell us, it's very hard and it won't come naturally. And therefore, you need courage. That courage is very important. Why do we need that courage? Because we know that a lot of people who speak up still fear negative consequences. Whistleblowers still need to use anonymous lines. This is not the norm to speak up. Bankers, 6 out of 10, they fear negative concept, they won't say anything. And even in healthcare, people don't speak to each other because they're scared. But as a psychologist, I find comfort in philosophers. And it was 300 before Christ when Aristotle said, fear is an innate part of courage. Without fear, you don't need courage. Do something even though you fear it is exactly what makes a person courageous. And that's what we all need to be. And that's how we need to support each other. Funny enough, at the last conference, I didn't have this bit of the talk. So I added that later, and I'll tell you why, because there was a question from someone in the audience. And she asked me, but what if it is really too scary to speak up? What do you do then? What if that organization, you might even say something, but what if the organization doesn't listen to you? So I thought it was quite important to add that bit to the talk. And before I start this bit of the talk, I'd like to tell you a few stories to highlight how this can affect that decision making. And the first one is about a night nurse. And this nurse, she's working the night shift, obviously, and she's about to give a high doses of medicine to a patient. And for a moment she thinks, wait, I might want to check this with the doctor. I need to give him a ring and check. But then she remembered that last time that doctor was on call, he called her incompetent. And that didn't feel really nice. So she decided to give the medicine anyway. When the Columbia space shuttle, I think it was Columbia last time, I got it wrong, got sent into space, during the launch, some of the protective film got damaged. Now, that wasn't really that important for the launch. It wasn't even that important for being in space. It was important for a safe return. Now, some of the engineers saw the impact that some of the debris had on that protective film. It wasn't super clear, so they had to do a proper investigation once in space. So they raised this issue with the management team. But at the time, NASA was pretty much under pressure. They wanted to launch a space shuttle every week. So the Columbia had to come back on time. And a spacewalk would lengthen their stay in space, and therefore they would lose money. So the manager says, no, thoughts and prayers, let's just hope everyone returns safely. I think most of you know how this story ends. 7 astronauts died within seconds of entering Earth's atmosphere. And then the last story is about Air Asiana flight that crashed when it landed, or tried to land, at San Francisco Airport in the summer of 2013. I think 3 people died and 181 were injured. There's nothing wrong with the airplane. Nothing. The co-pilot was too scared to say we're flying too low, too slow. So, what's going on in all these situations? When we talk about these situations, we're actually talking about the underlying belief of psychological safety. Psychological safety is not the belief that you have within yourself, but it's a shared belief amongst people that you will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. This is a very important phenomenon that was formulated by William Kahn. It was researched even more by Amy Edmondson. And Amy Edmondson was an organizational psychologist, and she looked at the impacts of psychological safety when it came to high-performance team. She found out that without psychological safety, no team can innovate or improve. EA, not learn from your mistakes. And funny enough, that makes sense. Because I want to take you to the brain, our brain. Everybody has this. This is not some specific person. Everybody has this. This is the amygdala. And the amygdala is the center of emotions. And the amygdala gets activated when we sense a situation that might endanger us, like we're in risk of dying. So the amygdala is very helpful because the amygdala activates a whole set of behaviors that's fantastic for our survival. So it prepares us by raising your heartbeat. You're ready to run. You're ready either to flight or to fight. Use your muscles. There's more blood in your muscles, therefore you can use them. Your breathing gets increased. And you start sweating. So you're ready to do something. Freeze is the one that is missing from this. Freeze is the process where you completely don't have a response in order to survive. And that's very helpful, especially when we encounter a bear. Most of the time, you do not find yourself at work in a life-threatening situation. Or you should not be, unless maybe you work in the army. The amygdala shuts down our prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is where all our thoughts and planning and creativity happens. It shuts off when we are in this response. We only work with that lower reptile brain, just fighting, running, no thinking. This is not very useful when you're at work. When most of you you need your prefrontal cortex in order to write that nice code or to, think about how we're going to solve this problem. Funny enough, that when we do get punished or when we get humiliated, the amygdala is triggered. And therefore, it's very hard to learn when we find ourselves in a psychological unsafe environment. I want to give you an example, because this is, I don't know if anybody has ever seen this slide, probably not. This is the results from Google's Aristotle project. We've got Aristotle back again. And Google wanted to find out what makes teams effective. They have loads of teams, lots of spread teams all over the globe. And they wanted to know what is the key thing when a team is effective, what's the key thing that underlies that? And they also found psychological safety. Psychological safety is the most important thing to be effective. Now, obviously, Edmondson was not surprised with that result. She already found that psychological safety is very essential in high-performance teams. And I found this quote from the head of industry of Google absolutely super appliant to why we have such a strong necessity for psychological safety in our work. And Amy Edmondson goes on to explain that if we have psychological safety, we do not have to give up on making or demanding things from each other or setting high goals for each other or wanting to achieve things. They actually have to go together. Without psychological safety, you will not feel the trust to share your mistake or to share your concern and therefore improve the process. So she puts them on two dimensions, as you can see here. We see this line, that's the dimension of the psychological safety, that's either high or low. And the other one is the accountability for the high demanding goals. And she goes on to explain there's different zones where you can find yourself in. Now, don't worry if you find yourself in a zone you don't want to be in. We can talk about that after the talk. If you find yourself in a situation where there is no psychological safety, but you're under pressure to perform every day, and I'm now referring back to my stories. That was the Arizona pilot. That was the nurse who couldn't share in a concern because of fear of being humiliated. You find yourself in the anxiety zone. This is not a nice zone to be in. This is where your amygdala is constantly activated. This is where a small mistake, not reported, becomes a big mistake. People might die in that situation. Then Amy Edmondson goes on to describe another zone, which is the apathy zone. There's nothing there. There is no accountability, there's no safety. This is not a very nice zone to be. You might be working in government if you find yourself in this zone. So get out if you can, or maybe you don't want to, I don't know. The comfort zone is nice. Nice and fluffy, lovely. We can all speak to each other. It's all nice. And it's all gezellig, as we say in Dutch, hygge in Danish. But you might be squashed by your competition because you're leaving money on the table and you're not pushing yourself to get the best out of your team, out of your work. So I would say you probably don't want to be there either. Maybe you do, I don't know, it's up to you. Where do we want to be? Well, I'd like to be in the learning zone. This is where you have both. You have high demands for your team members, but because you offer the psychological safety, people feel that they can make mistakes. And Amy Edmondson calls it failing fast to succeed quick. And I think when I look at this, this is where we can become more ethical with each other, because a concern shared here is a concern taken serious. Now, obviously, you're all asking, how do you make people feel more psychologically safe? How do you help others to share their concerns? In other words, how can you help others to become more courageous when it comes to speaking up? Well, there's a few things that I want to give to you. Obviously, it's not easy to create that psychological safety. It requires a lot of work from the people who are either in a team lead position or manager positions. But I think by thinking and remembering these three things, we can all make a start by helping each other. And the first thing that we can do is setting context. And that context is essential for people to understand that if you say, this is not so much an execution problem, but more a learning problem, therefore we need everyone on board, it sets the tone for people to voice their concerns, to voice their ideas. Obviously, don't shoot down ideas that you think are crap, okay? That's just one, don't do that. Even be kind to each other. Acknowledge fallibility. Let people see you're a human being. You cannot predict everything. You cannot oversee every potential issue when you're writing a piece of code. You need other people to tell you. And therefore saying, I need to hear from you whether I'm missing something, creates, again, that voice for people to speak to you. And the last one is about curiosity. This is, I think, the hardest bit for everyone, even for me. We are being taught, again, that it's quite normal to, when something goes wrong, that we say it's my fault, I'm to blame. But blaming leads to conflict, and conflict does not always result in better solutions. So Edmondson says, replace this blame by curiosity. And curiosity means asking questions. Ask questions. If you assume you know everything beforehand, you will not find out what is really going on. So ask the questions in order to really find out what happened. Most of the situations, when there's actually really blame, it's only 2% of the situations where we can actually find a real blame. But most of the situations are addressed as a blameworthy situation. I want to, as I'm coming to the end of my talk, I want to leave you with this philosopher again today. This is an American philosopher. And I think she's dead right when she says this. Just because we know something doesn't mean we're going to be able to change it. But not being aware of something will guarantee that you won't change it. If anyone is interested in helping by the conversation around ethics, around ethics and in technology, my co-worker Anne Curry from Container Solutions, she organized the first ever ethic conference back in July, and she's got this website that helps people. If you've got questions around this, if you want to help to in the discussion around this, please visit this website. I think that's it for me today. Thank you very much for listening.
We have time for one, maybe two questions. Anybody? He's first. Before.
Hi. So my question has to do with, so on let's say my company is doing something extremely unethical, whatever it may be. If it's my responsibility to speak up, isn't that extremely convenient for, let's say, the CEO of the company? Because if, let's say, the social blame lies on me, on the other developers that we are doing God knows what, but isn't that just convenient for the company? The fact that we are going to be blamed instead of them. And if I take that responsibility, am I not absolving them of the decision? Because in the end, I'm not the billionaire owner, right? And, you know, my job security is at risk and everything. So I face basically more consequences than them. I didn't get the reward in the first place, or at least not the huge reward they get. But now it's also my ethical... So
your identity is at stake a little bit.
That is...
That's what you're saying. It's like I said, these situations are not always as clear-cut, easy to make a decision what is best for you to do. Are you the only one in this company who's feeling this? That's a real question. Oh, okay. So for me, it would only raise more questions, this hypothetical question. So I'm very curious. So I want to know, are you the only person? Are there more people who feel like this? Could you maybe mobilize those people? Could you do something like Microsoft? So there's loads of things, but they all have, you need to go through like a process almost, which makes an answer not as easy or black and white as sometimes we like it to be.
Hello, thanks for your talk. My question is related kinda to his, but to what to do in case of lack of privilege. Let's say you're an immigrant in the States, that your visa depends on your employee. You're in South America when you don't have many opportunities for work. So if you speak up,
Yes,
bye-bye.
exactly.
And all
So-
this situation, because in Europe here, it's kind of easy to say, I moved
Yeah.
here somewhere, but
Yeah, so the whistleblowers in America, they're still not protected by law. So I know that a lot of countries, it's very different. And therefore it becomes even more essential what those next steps are going to be. So maybe you're not allowed to speak to your manager in this situation, but maybe you're allowed to speak to someone outside your company, someone you trust, someone you can talk to about this. Microsoft's letter was anonymous. Nobody knows who signed that letter. So it's an issue, I think, you guys as a community need to raise and help each other when it comes to answering these very complicated questions. And I think you're going to have, maybe you're more able to address that question than I am from my perspective. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, if one has it. Otherwise, I'll have a question.
Yeah.
So the question is, I saw that the question was there was a quote from the head of technology of
Yes.
Google, and I'm like, Google are having a lot of ethical problems. I mean, I could expand, but you can see where I'm going. It's like, okay, so they are aware of something is going on.
Yeah.
So it's the situation of, oh, it could have been much worse, guys. So it's all right.
Yes. So the thing is that specific research they did was on the effectiveness of teams. Just because you've got an effective team doesn't automatically make you an ethical company. They're not. They don't mutually exclude each other. But I think if you have an organization or a culture where it's normal to speak up, people are could be more courageous to do that. But as you also see from my talk, it is quite hard to speak up because we don't want to be different or we don't want to stand out. We feel that maybe this person has authority and therefore we don't say anything. So these processes are not, Google is not protected from that, as to say, because it's full of human beings who suffer from these phenomena. Yeah. Yeah.
If nobody more questions, thank you very much for your time and everything.